Okay, hello everyone. Welcome back from the networking break. I hope everyone had the opportunity to grab a snack, grab a beverage, and have a nice conversation with someone new. My name is Betty, and I am the Chief of Staff at Visionaries Club, and I spend my time between leading our platform team on all things portfolio related, supporting our founders, our portfolio companies, and our LPs, as well as working on operational and strategic projects within Visionaries Club itself. I have the great pleasure today of welcoming our next panel and our next speakers. These are people who almost don't need an introduction, two modern-day European tech legends, and I have a great privilege of giving them a short introduction before they come on stage to tell you a little bit more about their professional and personal journeys. So first up, we have Eléonore Crespo, the CEO and co-founder of Pigment. And she is a luminary in the French tech ecosystem, but of course in the broader European tech ecosystem as well. Having founded or co-founded Pigment, coming off of being in tech herself, spending time at Google, and also in VC as an investor at Index. Joining Eléonore, we have Hanno Renner, who is the CEO and co-founder of Personio. Hanno founded Personio in 2015 alongside his friends and his classmates at CDTM in Munich, after seeing a real need to revolutionize software for HR processes. And hosting us, we have Daphné from Sifted, a senior reporter covering the French tech ecosystem, which of course has so much excitement and action happening, especially over these last few days. Please join me in welcoming Eléonore, Hanno, and Daphné.
Hello, and welcome. My name is Daphné Leprince-Ringuet. I'm a French tech reporter for Sifted. We're a media publication that covers European tech and startups. And it's my pleasure to be your moderator for today's panel, very exciting panel, which is featuring two of Europe's most distinguished entrepreneurs, I'd say. Welcome, Eléonore and Hanno. I don't think we need to introduce you so much anymore, but I guess it's my job, so I will. We've got Hanno Renner here, who is the co-founder of Germany's Personio. So Personio is a tech company that manages HR tasks like payroll, holiday booking, absence tracking, etc. for SMBs. You're now, according to our latest reporting, operating across 70 countries. You've got a team of 2,000 people plus. You've got, tens of thousands of customers, and I believe you were last valued at around 8.5 billion. So that's that. Eléonore Crespo here is the founder of Pigment, which I think I've seen described many times as the competitor for Excel. Pigment is a platform for enterprises that lets them access in real time data that is usually siloed, so like finance data, HR data, etc. I can personally attest to the fact that you are one of the favorite French tech startups of our president, Emmanuel Macron. And actually, his post on LinkedIn when you raised your Series D last year is the reason that I know you have reached $1 billion valuation, which you would not confirm to me on the record. So that is that. I think the title of this panel is self-explanatory. We're going to be picking the brains of two of the smartest and brightest entrepreneurs in Europe about how you build a global SaaS company from Europe. A conversation that seems particularly topical at the moment, I think, as Europe shows that it is capable not only of creating these companies, but of retaining them as well, which I think was a topic we've seen a lot this week, especially. Without much more in the way of an introduction, I'm going to dive right in. So I've heard you guys described as a European company with global reach, as a global company with European origins, a European company operating globally, etc., etc. It feels generally like, especially at the moment, as I said, the terminology around these things is quite important or sensitive, which potentially speaks to Europe's fear, maybe, of seeing some of the biggest companies that are created here leave as they grow bigger and bigger, often to the US, of course. So let's start by setting the record straight. How would you guys describe yourselves exactly, and how does that reflect your positioning with Europe and abroad?
Okay, so I'll start with Pigment. So first of all, we are starting to be a global company. I think we are far yet, to be a truly global company. But to give you an idea, today we are mostly in the US and in Europe. US is 60% of our revenue, and the rest is shared between France, Germany, and the UK as our main markets. So that's already like just from a go-to-market standpoint. So I think for us, we are two French founders based in Paris. We want to stay here. We want to build a global leader from France. All of our tech is in Paris. We build and develop everything in Paris. But clearly, because of what we do and the software we're developing, the market is elsewhere. And I think that's actually the power of being European, is that, day one, you realize when you're French that, hey, I can definitely not build a leader if I'm just going to focus on one country. And so it forces you to think really, really deep. And of course, especially when you go enterprise with a software like Pigment, the US is going to be, no doubt, your number one market. So we decided to go there very early, meaning 3 years ago, and we've kept expanding then since then.
Yeah, I think between Personio and Pigment and Eléonore and I, we have many things in common and something are different. I think what we have in common is that the European pride and the desire to build a European champion. But we also, I think what's different is that Pigment obviously is so focused on enterprise companies, so they have to much earlier go to the US because that's where the big companies are. Versus for us in Europe, we now have in hundreds of millions of revenue and we just have 2% of the market share in Europe because we focus on SMEs. But I don't think it really matters as much when we have customers that use the product all around the world. We have a team that's global, that's based in the US, Europe, and in 9 different countries. But I think what really matters is that we manage in Europe to build actually scaled companies and continue to scale them larger. And I'm not talking about, we now need to have the next Google and so on. I'm talking about that type of company that are between 10 and 100 billion in market cap, of which there's hundreds of public market companies in the US and very few technology companies in Europe of that size. And I think that's what we need to build. And with a slightly different approach from a customer base, that's, I think, both of our ambition. But it's would be my take on what we need.
Yeah, definitely. Okay. So I guess bouncing back on that, Eléonore, you mentioned the fact that from the start you wanted to be a global company. I think that's something we hear a lot among founders here in Europe. They want to be a global company, but obviously it's harder said than done. For both of you, you've managed to get there. What would you say are the key things that enabled you to do so? Or perhaps a better question is actually what are the traps that you didn't fall into that enabled you to get there?
Okay, so maybe I will start with the investors, because I think that was actually one of the really tipping points into helping us going abroad. And I have to say, if you're a seed company here in this room, visionaries, go with them. If they give you a term sheet, don't refuse. They are absolutely phenomenal. And actually, we decided to have visionaries as part of our seed round for that reason, was to say, actually, we know there are these already fantastic European players with deep roots in Germany. I clearly, as a founder, had no roots in Germany. So having them on the cap table helped me know actually incredible people like Hanno. That's actually how we met. And I think that was one of the first things. So we went after an investor base that was diverse, with people obviously in Europe, but also in the US. So very early on, we started to bring angels and funds in the US to help us find the best talents and the first customers. And I have to say that going alone in these countries is very hard. I think for us, it would have been very hard, for instance, to start in the US without having a proof from our investor base that we were a legit company. And so they really helped us actually get to our first customers and also get to our first go-to-market candidates that would help us develop the market. So this is really where I would start actually.
Did you want to add something, Hanno? Otherwise I can bounce off that. Yeah, on the investors, because that is actually something I wanted to bring up, and I think it's often something that we hear as well with European companies raising from foreign investors. There's obviously the other way of looking at it with this kind of fear that raising from foreign investors might be a risk, might represent a risk that the company will then eventually suddenly decide to relocalize to the US. So do you think that's a well-conceived fear? And if so, how did you both navigate that in your fundraising?
So first of all, I think talking about capital, which is one important ingredient in building a global category leader, I don't think we have a gap and shortage of capital access as European founders. I think by now you can, maybe as Eric Schmidt said this morning, you can't raise a couple of billion to build factories for chips, but what you can definitely do is build software companies and get plenty of capital for that. most of our investors do come from the US, and that's a little bit unfortunate because of the fear that you're talking about, but just because our returns will go to the US, and we will fund pension funds in Canada, and we will fund our returns will fund Harvard's endowment rather than the endowments of the universities here or the pension funds of countries in Germany. So I think that is something that that annoys me about it, from a fear of where being pressured to go into US or become a US company, that I'm not very worried about. I think if you pick the right investors, they want to be part of your journey, they want to support you, but they let you decide what's right for the business and where we continue to be headquartered, where we will IPO, all of the decisions that I and the leadership team at Personio gets to make, and not our investors. But I do think the fact that all the capital flows back into different economies and different markets, that's unfortunate. But hopefully we can change that over time here as well with funds like Visionaries.
Eléonore, I know that in a former life you were an investor yourself. Do you think that helps you in any way kind of see these things coming or avoiding some pitfalls?
Yes, absolutely. So I was at Index Ventures for the context before founding Pigment. And it gave me, first of all, an amazing lens to understand what incredible looks like in terms of building a company. And not only that, but I think I truly understood, to your earlier question, where investors can really be helpful and where they can't. And what is your responsibility as a founder? So, when you're asking, do you have the pressure to move or do you have the pressure to do something? Well, actually, a good investor is never here to put pressure on you. You should know better. You should follow your customers. So, if your customers require you to be in a certain geo, then go, right? But you shouldn't go because your investors push you to go. So I think for me, like my investor lens gave me obviously the idea of things that perhaps, seeing a lot of mistakes that I should avoid, but also showing me the amazing things that can be achieved actually from Europe with so many global leaders that are already here and that manage to do phenomenal companies from here.
Great. So both of your companies obviously have presence way beyond Europe now. But is it correct, I guess, to say that growing in Europe first, or certainly at some point of the development of the company, was key to growing into a global champion? I suppose it's fair to say that. So I wanted to focus a little bit more on scaling in Europe specifically as a European company. And Hanno, you already kind of brought in the challenge of building a product for specific customers, and I can imagine that building that across Europe came with its particular set of challenges. Again, what would you say were the key things to look out for when you were growing Personio in Europe?
I think Eléonore said earlier that starting in Europe and starting in one country in Europe ensures that you very quickly realize, okay, I'm not going to build a large company just by staying in that market. So very quickly you start thinking about new markets, and maybe much earlier than in other if you start in the US, and especially in industries like finance, like HR, and many others. There's localization and going to new markets doesn't just mean, we translate the product and we hire some French-speaking, English-speaking, Dutch-speaking, whatever reps, but you actually really need to understand those local markets. And I think that really prepares you for building a global multi-country company much more than if you're in one homogeneous market where everything is the same. So I think there's actually a benefit from starting in a market like Europe, where you're much more exposed to that. And it obviously brings challenges. So it is harder in the beginning to scale as rapidly. Each of those markets are a little bit small in itself, even if the total of them is large, but it helps you to think much more international, think much more in different markets, and learn a playbook of how you enter markets, make mistakes, rather than if you grow to 200 million revenue only in the US, and then at that point, for the first time you enter a new market. Many companies have failed with that.
Was there a particular strategy behind that? I heard, obviously some companies do a lot of M&A or prefer to kind of grow more organically, hire on the ground as opposed to sending a team. Were there specific things that you remember as being quite key to the success of opening new markets in Europe?
Yeah, so we have done a couple of M&As, but never for market entry. I think we believe our technology needs to be adapted towards that market rather than trying to bolt on something there. And then I think from a team perspective, also culturally, especially if you open, we have 8 offices by now, but I would say if I walk in any of these offices, it still always feels like the Personio culture. And I think that's harder to achieve with M&A. So I think that mix of bringing people from your initial office into these new markets, ensuring that they help launch their team is probably a widespread understood element. But then really, I think you as founder also spending time there, spending time with with your first customers to learn what is actually different, not just in the product needs they have, but also how they go to market. And I think there we learned a lot of things, how Dutch HR managers have a very different set of things they look for and how they want to buy software than the UK. And I think those uniques is what you need to tease out earlier and then adapt to them. And the last point I would make is for those local country teams that you then build for each of the markets, ensure that you give them enough of, yes, it's a scaled company by now and we want to have some things that systems and so on we use, but also give them enough flexibility to be entrepreneurial, to figure out those things that you initially figured out as a founder in your core market, but that might be different for the new markets.
Would you say that there's like specific challenges linked to the fact that you're a SaaS company as opposed to, I don't know, a deep tech or a fintech or others? Is the SaaS model particularly well suited or less well suited to this kind of growth across borders?
So I would say it has never been a better time to create a SaaS company in Europe. I mean, with the play that we can now have, how much we can play offense on AI, there has never been a better time. Reason being that AI helps you completely remove the borders of what you do. You can localize your platform in no time, you know, from a language standpoint, but even from whatever is needed to develop standpoint. I think we are probably 12 months from having what we would call the automated software engineer. So that means that there has never been a better time to actually accelerate your R&D, whether you're in Europe or anywhere else. The fragmentation does not exist as such anymore. So that's the first thing. I don't think there is a specific difference between, you know, being a fintech and a SaaS company. Actually, I think it's pretty similar, right? Like you can create a global company no matter what you play on. But I would say, again, like the strength of being European when you create a SaaS business goes beyond the fact that you are in a small country. It's also that it's way harder for a US company to come to Europe than from a European company to go to the US. Because when you're here, you understand that other countries have complexity, whether it's from an HR standpoint, whether it's from a financial standpoint, whether it's from, it can be really any type of jurisdiction standpoint, you realize it very early on. So you build your team around that. And you really try to find talents, like from a diversity standpoint, to really help you scale. And it's much harder when you come from a single market to do the contrary.
I wanted to talk a little bit more about talent as well. So I know that my colleague Miriam wrote a really great piece about Personio recently. I'll do a little bit of marketing here. But she mentioned quite a few hires that you did, Hanno, that were coming from the US, basically experienced managers that were able to, I guess, bring the company a step forward when it was growing. We'll obviously compare this to your experience as well, Eléonore, but I'll start with Hanno. Would you say that there is a challenge with talent as well in Europe, that we don't have the experienced managers that you need to scale your company?
Yeah, that is definitely probably from the ingredients of building a software company or technology company in Europe, one of the ones where we're a bit disadvantaged. But I think when we think about talent, you can't just say we have a talent problem, but there's two different types of talent I would think about. The one is smart, entry level, or a few years of experience. We have amazing talent. We have a ton of really good universities that bring them. We have people that worked in a few years, and that is not a problem at all. And in fact, the fact that there's a bunch of them, it's less competitive, and they're also by far not as expensive as if you build a company in Silicon Valley. That's a huge advantage actually on the talent front. So that is no problem at all. Then you have the very senior people, like your C-level staff that you need to hire, and there we have a problem, especially once you get to a certain scale, that there's not that many CROs, CMOs, and so on that have done that before at scale. But again, I think that can be solved, as you just talked about. A lot of my direct reports have been relocated from Silicon Valley and other parts, and that is possible because it's a little bit harder to find them. It takes a bit longer, but then you find that person, and then you bring them across with their family and their dog and whatever, and they're happy, and that's fine, and they love Europe. I think the biggest problem is that middle part, where we're talking the head of product marketing, we're talking the director reward, like these functions that equally are much less prevalent here because from that type of companies, because you don't have as many companies here in Europe, but they're not as targeted at one or two that you can just pull over, but you need tens or dozens of them, and that's going to be a different difficulty. And I think that's the part where I'm hopeful that when companies like Personio and Pigment grow bigger, that at some point the people that learned in our companies go on to the next generation. And that's only like, that's a matter of flywheel keep spinning and spinning off this talent. But that's the part where I have the biggest issues. And that's the one I think where if you are a scale company in the US, you obviously can tap into a different type of talent. Similarly also with senior engineers, L7, L6 engineers, the amount of talent that has gone through the similar journeys is just not as prevalent here.
Yeah, I would say, so I cannot agree more with everything you said. I would add two things. One is talent has always been my hardest challenge. Your hardest challenge, we are talking about that. That is going to be the hardest challenge of any founder for the entire life of their company. And it's something that you always have to reinvent. And I think the talent pool that we have in 2025 is also very different from the talent pool we had 10 years ago. And things keep evolving, which is actually a very good thing. We are missing talents in AI, not from an engineering standpoint, but from a business standpoint. I think we are truly missing talent to know in Europe how to market our AI capabilities to the world and how to sell these AI capabilities. That's going to be a big problem for European companies, I think, in the next couple of years. And this is where I'm pushing universities, for instance, here in France, to create more trainings and companies to create more trainings. That's really the number one thing I'm worried about. But on the flip side, there is something where Europe is absolutely exceptional, is that our talents here, for instance, you take engineering talent, they are not only the best talents that you can find in the world, but also they are very loyal. And I think we tend to forget that, is that in the US, yes, of course, you have more people from more companies, but you have a lot more offer and a lot more demand, right? So it creates a market that is a lot more liquid, yes, but people are mercenaries. They stay 2 years at your company, they stay 3 years and they move on. And that's really bad for any company, especially when you have a 10, 20 years vision in front of you that you're trying to execute on. To give you an idea, for instance, at Pigment, our engineering team, since the beginning of Pigment, the company is 6 years old, only 2 engineers left. That's all. Everybody else stayed. And when I told that to my US investors, they were like, wait a minute, like, that's crazy. We've never heard that before. And so I think that's, what is amazing when you're a global company is that you can capitalize on this European strength and then find go-to-market talents. Obviously in the US, Hanno did very, very well, brings them back to Europe, and then obviously, hopefully train the next wave of talent, especially from an AI standpoint.
Yeah, and I would build on that to just really echo that also for early stage founders that might listen to us and like, oh, but then I might as well just go to San Francisco and build a company there. You're going to have a very hard time tapping into any of the really good talent because you will be a no one there. You don't have a network. You're not a real entrepreneur, and you don't even know what then the good ones are. So you're going to pay shitload of money for a very average at best engineer versus what you could find here in Europe. So I think yes, if you could scale here and then if I could beam ourselves at our scale of a couple billion in valuation, where you could give out big packages, pay big salaries, and then could pick this one areas where we'd love to have some other talent to yes, that would be great. But if I would have to go back and say, would I have started a company in San Francisco because there's better talent? No way. I definitely don't think that's a good idea, and that's not what any early stage founder should take away from this.
Circling back a tiny bit to the fragmentation challenge. So we've talked about fragmentation in terms of deploying a product and like being able to anticipate various different cultures, various different needs in different countries in Europe. But obviously there's also a lot of fragmentation at the level of business rules and so on. And I know that you've both been quite vocal in terms of wanting to harmonize Europe in that respect. You're both signatories to the EU Inc. initiative, which was last year, if I remember well. The idea to create a 28th regime that will harmonize the rules for European companies that would be applied across the region. It feels like we're seeing more and more of these kind of initiatives. There's more and more willingness obviously from founders, but also at the level of the EU to listen to these things. I guess my question is how realistic are these things? And when do you think we could be starting to see a change?
So yes, I am very passionate about like leveling the playing field a little bit across European states and countries. I think there's I think the problem is not the lack of ideas or what we could be doing. I think there is a fundamental incentive problem that in Europe, while we could say we're I think one president said it once, we're the United States of Europe. If we think of that mindset and optimize that for the common good, we could say, okay, we want to have just leading technology companies across all markets, and it doesn't matter whether they're in France or whether they're in Germany and so on. But it sort of does matter. Even Macron, who is the most forward-leaning, obviously celebrates that we have someone in France, and it's fantastic that we have Eléonore and Pigment here. But I think there's this incentives to optimize locally for each government and to support their local tech ecosystem rather than think, okay, how can we really break down the boundaries? And I think that is the issue we have. I think we can all wish and hope that AI is enough of a wake-up call, that we need to be competitive with China and the US, and that this leads us to break down some of these boundaries. But then you also have to look into the countries and their local politics, and what actually gets them re-elected is not to free up. I mean, in fact, there's a lot of the European countries, there's a push toward the right. There's more about, we should even put up barriers. We should protect ourselves from competition inside the European Union. I think that's exactly the wrong movement, and all of this shift to the right that's happening in regional elections will counter making us more competitive as a continent. And I think fighting that is probably the underlying trend, and then hoping to really think with a European first model and with what are the changes we need to drive to achieve that. But that's, I think, where we need to start.
Yeah, it very much has like the spirit of harmonizing these things or being on the same page has very much been the spirit of the past 2 days, I'd say. It kind of links with this, but I wanted to talk as well about the issue of exits. So we talked about scaling the company, the challenges of scaling a company in Europe, but obviously the exit challenge kind of looms over all that. And I think a lot of times when I'm talking to founders, the conclusion is, we're kind of ticking all the other boxes, but or at least we're getting there on many of the other boxes, but the exit market is like, we're still so far from having figured that out. What's kind of your perspective on this, Eléonore?
So first of all, I think as founders, we should never think about an exit. That's the first thing I would say. Focus on building your product, focus on building your technology, and play for the long run. Play for like 10, 20 years down the line. That's what I do every day. It's like my only focus right now is to think about how to play offense on AI. That's the only thing I care about. And so I would say, first of all, we've seen major companies that get private funding for as long as possible. And I have to say, for me, that's what I want. I want to remain independent with private funding for as long as possible, because this is the only way to be able to innovate at your own pace. And so you see companies in the likes of Databricks that are today obviously massive, or OpenAI or many other, that are still private. And today we have this private capital in the market. You don't need to IPO anymore. Sorry for the bankers in the room, but that's a reality. And so I think there is a real possibility actually for European founders to live as is for many, many years, and that's actually the best thing that can happen to you. And so, if at some point you need to IPO, perhaps for us, given number one market is in the US, maybe at some point it will be in the US, but that's just a step in the journey. And nobody should care about that until it comes to the table for whatever reason, and it has to be a good reason. And I haven't found a good reason for my company so far.
Yeah, I could not agree more. It's not focused on the exit. In fact, that is maybe one of the biggest problems next to talent and capital. Let's consider it all solved. It's the mindset of founders of wanting to build out companies. Where we started with the conversation of we want to have companies that are 10 or 100 billion. That means not founding a company that you want to exit in 5 years. That's not going to happen in 5 years. We're now 10 years, 6, 7 years on a journey, 6 years, 10 years, and we're just getting started. We're still tiny companies compared to the potential, and that's what you shouldn't think about an exit, also not at our stage. You should think about, okay, how can we now make this a bigger company? And I think that's also a bit of a societal problem that we then pat ourselves on the back. Oh, you made it to whatever, couple billion valuation or thousands of employees. You're done. No, you're not done. Now there's the potential of building a big company. So I don't think thinking about exit is the right thing, but really thinking about how can we make those companies much bigger, and therefore the exit question itself is mute, I think.
There's many more things we could have discussed, but I guess the topic of an exit is a good way to finish. We've run out of time, unfortunately, but thank you so much for this really fascinating conversation. Please give a warm round of applause to our panelists.
Thank you.